All right. Hello, everyone. I'm John Butler with the California Air Resources Board. Before we get started today, I will give some preliminary explanations. The workshop today is being held on Zoom. Note that today we will be using the Q&A function, but not the chat function. If you have any technical issues, please type them into the Q&A. We will have live translation into Spanish. The translator will now come on and explain how to use the system. After that explanation, we will activate the translation channels.
Hi, hello everyone. I will provide the instructions to access the simultaneous translation. I will do so first in Spanish and then in English. Para hacer uso del servicio de interpretación, por favor vaya a la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom, en donde aparecen los controles, haga clic en el icono de interpretación que aparece como un globo terráqueo y seleccione español. Si se está conectando a través de la aplicación móvil, desde un celular o tableta, presione los puntos suspensivos, después interpretación y después el idioma. To use the Zoom interpretation feature, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are, click on the interpretation icon that appears as a globe, select English or Spanish, and if you're joining on a Zoom app, whether it's a cell phone or a tablet, please press the ellipsis, then interpretation, and then choose your language. Thank you.
All right, and now I will start the interpretation channels. Okay, so those should be live. If you have any trouble with those, please put something in the Q&A. Note that if you're listening today in English, you should probably use the English language channel in Zoom. That way, if someone makes a comment in Spanish, you will hear the translation into English. During the open comment period, if you want to make a comment, you can type into the Q&A function, raise your hand, or use *9 to raise your hand if you're attending by phone. We will limit comments today to 3 minutes in order to preserve time for everyone to speak. Also note that we will not be calling on people with raised hands until the public comment period. This workshop is being recorded. After the workshop, we will make the recording available online on the CARB website. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As I mentioned, I'm John Butler, and I am in the Sustainable Communities Policy and Planning section at the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. Other CARB staff we have here today are Leslie Cumuricito, manager of my section, Ian Peterson in Leslie's section, Nesamani Kalandiur, the manager of the Transportation Analysis section, and Asha Natakal in Nesamani's section, among others. The workshop today is about 2 topics related to CARB Sustainable Communities program. After some background information about SB 375, the first topic will be changes that are in progress for the system that CARB uses to evaluate regions' sustainable community strategies, or briefly, the evaluation process. The second topic will be the update of the regional targets for greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles, or briefly, the target update. We will start with presentations by Asha Natakal, Ian Peterson, and me about the 2 topics. Following that, we will have a panel discussion about the target update, including representatives from regions, state agencies, and others, which will be emceed by Leslie Cumuricito. Then we will have time for public questions and recommendations about these 2 topics. To begin, we have some poll questions to see who we have here today. Shafi? Okay, I think we're seeing the poll number 2, if I'm correct. And what I see there is where people are affiliated with. And there we have quite a lot in the regional governments, about half of everyone here, about 12% from the state of California, 7% from local governments. We have also a large nonprofit and NGO contingent of 15%. Private organizations 9%, and other 10%. So Is the other poll going to come up? Or all right. Well, we have a pretty good mix of people here today. We have about 20% from Northern California, about 20% from the Sacramento area, about 15% from the Bay Area, 20% again from the San Joaquin Valley, and also from the Southern California area, and then only about 2% from the Inland Empire today. So that's our total. And just so you know, we have a good attendance today. About 111 people are attendees today, in addition to the panelists and everyone else here online. Okay, so thank you all for that participation. And now for some background. Under Senate Bill 375 or SB 375, CARB sets a passenger vehicle greenhouse gas emissions reduction target for each California metropolitan planning organization. To meet the target, metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, develop regional plans called sustainable community strategies, which identify land use and transportation strategies to reduce these emissions. The sustainable community strategies, or SCSs, are an integral part of regional transportation plans, prepared and adopted by MPOs and are routinely updated every 4 or 5 years. The sustainable community strategies must be approved by the California Air Resources Board. Sustainable community strategies provide a vision or forecast for a region's future land use pattern and transportation network that will meet emissions reduction targets. CARB reviews the sustainable community strategies after adoption and makes either an accept or a reject determination that the plan will meet the region's targets if implemented. While implementation of SCSs is not required, and SCSs require actions by many different entities, some state policy incentives are in place to encourage implementation. SB 375 provides CEQA provisions for certain types of projects, including an exemption and limited environmental analysis. In addition, certain state funding pots have eligibility or prioritization criteria for projects that are within that region's approved sustainable community strategy. An MPO region that is unable to create a plan that meets the GHG reduction targets must create an alternative planning strategy, or APS, that shows how the region could meet the targets. In that case, the region would become ineligible for certain state transportation funding provisions. When California lawmakers enacted SB 375, they used the existing system of metropolitan planning organizations as the geography where the law would be implemented in the regions. This map shows the 18 MPO regions in California in orange. The green areas are not subject to SB 375. This slide shows the requirements for an SCS. In general, though, an SCS must include a forecasted regional development pattern or where homes and businesses are expected to be built. The development pattern must be integrated with the planned transportation network and other strategies or measures to achieve the regional GHG reduction target if implemented. Currently, most MPOs have developed and CARB has evaluated 3 rounds of SCSs, and most regions around the state are in process of creating their 4th SCS to meet specific targets that CARB set in 2018. Once an MPO adopts its SCS, the region submits the plan to CARB for evaluation and a determination. To do the evaluation, CARB staff apply a set of guidelines that it updated in 2019. So that is some background on SB 375. We're now going to start in on the first topic for today, the evaluation process. I will hand it over to Asha to walk us through more specifics.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ashia Natikal. I'm in the Transportation Analysis section at CARB in Nesamani's team. And today we will discuss and seek comments and suggestions on the medium-term topic changes in the guidelines. 。
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ashia Natikal. I'm in the Transportation Analysis section at CARB in Nesamani's team. And today we will discuss and seek comments and suggestions on the medium-term topic changes in the guidelines.
Thank In the January workshop, CARB staff presented the planned three-phased approach with short, medium, and longer-term steps to clarify and update the existing SCS evaluation process. The topics included in the short-term phase are effective immediately, as they only require clarification of CARB's expectations on GHG calculations. These clarifications do not require any changes to the existing guidelines. The medium-term topics focus on procedural changes in the evaluation process and do not affect the SCS development. The topics included in the long-term phase would require more significant changes to the guidelines that would change the quantification or process or both. For more information on the phased approach, you can refer to the slides and recordings available on CARB's website. For today's presentation, CARB staff will discuss the proposed update to a medium-term topic. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the medium-term topics focus on procedural changes in the evaluation process and do not affect the SCS development. Once the approaches to medium-term topics are finalized, considering that the MPOs require advance notice of any changes made to the process, these changes will be effective after 6 months of finalizing the document. Since January, CARB staff have worked on drafting the first of the 3 medium-term topics. Over the next few slides, I will provide an overview of the proposed changes, walk through CARB's process for taking comments and finalizing, and then open it up for discussion. The purpose of this proposed update is to simplify guidance and clarify the processes of collaboration when developing the technical methodology and submittal of a sustainable community strategy. This figure provides an overview of the SCS evaluation process. The proposed changes provide more guidance on what to expect at key milestones here, mainly the technical methodology, draft RTP SCS, and final submittal. During the previous cycles, inconsistencies in the timing and completeness of key milestones call for additional information in the guidelines to boost transparency. The proposed updates serve CARB and metropolitan planning organizations, hereby referred to as MPOs, by helping to identify opportunities for collaboration on addressing substantive issues before the SCS is adopted. By doing so, MPOs can provide greenhouse gas emission reduction estimates for public review that are acceptable and in accordance with CARB guidance, streamline the SCS submittal, minimize the need for plan amendments, and CARB can conduct the SCS evaluation more efficiently. CARB staff propose revisions to Chapter 8, that is the MPO CARB Information Exchange and Submittals, starting at page 52 of the 2019 SCS Evaluation Guidelines. Details of the proposed revisions are available in the memo online. I will briefly go over CARB staff's proposed revisions, which include updates to subsections on the collaboration milestones, technical methodology, and final RTP SCS submittal. CARB staff also propose a new subsection on the draft RTP SCS. The first key collaboration milestone is during the submittal of the technical methodology. The MPO is required to submit a technical methodology to CARB prior to starting the public participation process. Early consultation is encouraged to identify and address issues prior to releasing estimates of GHG emissions for public review. CARB staff advise MPOs to provide the technical methodology at least 6 months before initiating the public participation process. MPOs should plan for at least 1 round of comments, though often 2 or more rounds are needed. CARB staff also advise MPOs to publicly release SCS GHG estimates or a draft plan after CARB has concluded that the technical methodology operates accurately and in accordance with CARB guidance. Second, CARB staff will review the draft RTP SCS and supporting materials during the public review period as resources allow. MPOs are advised to include the updated technical methodology with the draft RTP SCS and make available supporting materials that will be included in the SCS submittal for CARB's final SCS evaluation. This is an important opportunity to resolve issues prior to finalizing the RTP SCS for adoption, while helping to streamline the SCS submittal process and avoiding the need for plan amendments. Lastly, once adopted by the governing board, the MPO submits the final RTP SCS with other information to support GHG quantification, if applicable to CARB for evaluation. The summary of MPO SCS submittal and supporting data requests is outlined in the memo. Prior to forwarding a recommendation for final issuance, CARB staff will arrange a consultation meeting with the MPO to walk through its preliminary findings and recommendations. If CARB staff's review results in a recommendation to accept the determination that the SCS meets the targets, CARB staff will proceed to prepare the required package of materials for CARB to issue an acceptance. Alternatively, if CARB staff's review results in a recommendation to reject the determination, then CARB staff will share how it came to a preliminary recommendation to reject the adopted SCS. Following the consultation meeting, if substantive issues remain, then CARB staff will issue written notice to the MPO with next steps detailed in the memo available online. CARB staff will take comments on these proposed revisions through August 30th, 2024. During this period, comments can be provided to CARB staff today during this workshop or submitted via email to sustainablecommunities@arb.ca.gov. CARB staff will consider comments received and anticipates posting final revisions for this topic by October 1st of 2024. For this topic, revisions will be effective 6 months from the date they are finalized. Towards the latter half of this workshop, we have set aside time for public comments and/or questions. In the meantime, if you have any immediate clarifying questions or comments, now's the time to ask if you have any immediate clarifying questions or comments on the proposed revisions of the medium-term topic, that is CARB MPO exchange and submittal process. So I do see a hand raised. Yes, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. One thing that I've noticed for 17, 18 years down here at Sandag is that quite often the board likes to use confusion about GHG and VMT. And I noticed that you allow that confusion to continue by always saying GHG. In fact, if you read the details of SB 375, they cannot take credit for anything that's done by the state. And the state's primary responsibility is the fleet. And that's the CAFE standards, corporate average fuel efficiency, and of course the electrification of the fleet. That's what the state does. That's their primary job. But down here, we have director after director, and you know, the board wants to do almost nothing. Okay, that's their whole mission in life, it seems, is to do as little as possible legally. And they'll go to the mat on that down here. I guess you're aware of the lawsuits that have taken place down here in San Diego. But so they will say things like, well, we don't have to worry about that because by then we'll all be driving electric cars. Now, these are people that don't really have anything good to say about electric cars generally, but for this process, they suddenly love electric cars and that's all they want to talk about. So you continue that by just talking about GHG. You must be aware of this confusion. So anyway, that's my first comment is that you should make it a little more difficult for the MPOs to claim that this would be solved by electric cars, so that they can do nothing. The other thing is that Kamala Harris, back in 2011, she was our Attorney General of California, and she had just been elected by in a very close election. They had to do a recount, and 2 weeks later they said she was the winner. And then within a few months, she joined a lawsuit by Cleveland National Forest Foundation. And her letter said that you can't ignore the CARB scoping plan because it's about climate stabilization, the objective of CEQA. Now, that was a big exaggeration, and she knew it, but she's a very smart lawyer, and she did take that case, argue it, and she won at Superior Court. She won in appellate court. She lost in the Supreme Court because they said, we wouldn't do this again, don't count on it, but you have until, at that time, it was 2040 to, I'm sorry, 2050, and this was in 2011. So CARB had time to get back on track. That's what the state Supreme Court said, but don't count on us doing this again. Now we're in a situation where the climate stabilization requirement is 2030. That's really the very first thing that you should say, so that all the people that are listening understand why it's a code red climate emergency, because climate stabilization is what we want to do. We want to avoid destabilization. That's mass starvation and human extinction. That's a bad thing. Okay, so in fact, that should be your focus. So now it's 2030. And so now we're talking 6 years away. So the Supreme Court would probably say, no, you cannot ignore the CARB scoping plan. But you are members of CARB, and you seem to be avoiding the CARB, ignoring the CARB scoping plan. It's like there's two CARBs. There's a CARB that had.
Hi, Mike.
Yeah.
Hi, Mike. This is Leslie Kimaracito. I think we've hit the 3-minute mark on here, but I appreciate your comments.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of things I did want to address. At this point, I do want to focus all our questions and comments at this point in the presentation on any clarifying things having to do with either the guidelines updates that we've just discussed that Asha's gone through, and we can have more public comment and the public comment portion of this piece. And I will probably actually at that point also respond to a number of comments you've made there. Thank you. Are there others who have specific clarifying questions or feedback having to do with this guidelines update proposal piece? And I think I see, it looks like, Laura, you have your hand up, and then I also see in the queue Dave Vaughton has a question, so we will go ahead and answer that. So maybe Laura first, please.
You need to give incentives for work from home jobs so people don't even have to commute to work. Because some people are just too low income to afford electric cars. They don't get any car, they bicycle, they take buses long ways, and they're so tired when they get to work. It's not really productive. It's not good for the companies also. But I don't know why there's no work from home jobs. No valid when some are scams, but maybe the state needs to do that. Anything could be done from home should be done from home.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Again, please focus comments at this point in time on the guidelines piece. I'm going to go ahead and read Dave's question here, which is, will changes to the CARB SCS guidelines be brought before the CARB board for approval? And if so, what month is staff proposing to do so? I will kick off, and no, Dave, actually the CARB board will not be moving forward for approval on the SCS guidelines. This is a process that staff will bring forward, and so this is not something that we will be bringing at a board meeting for approval. The process, as is laid out by Asha, is basically we will be taking comments on the draft memo, both here, but also mostly, I suspect, through written comments or your own communications with CARB staff, basically through the end of next month. We will make any necessary adjustments as needed, and then go ahead and post any final revisions there. And then the idea is that this particular set of proposed revisions would become effective 6 months after that finalization. And let's see, I see 2 more hands raised. I'm going to go to Elizabeth first and then Clint. Let me see. Maybe Elizabeth, I don't know if someone can unmute her.
I have allowed her to unmute. Let me try this again. So Elizabeth Hahn.
I was going to comment, but I think I'm just going to hold off for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. All right.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. With that,
Well, I think Mr. Higgins has put his hand up.
oh,
Wondering if you are open to putting your own responses on some kind of time clock so that both sides are speedy in responses and not just have this be a one-way?
We are definitely open to that. And I believe some of the draft does call out proposed timelines for ourselves in responding. But if there are additional milestones in terms of the timing that folks want in there, we are definitely open to that. Thanks for the question. All right, very good. I know we're moving along in time, so let's get to the portion of the presentation on target setting.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Asha. To the next section, as I mentioned, 2 topics. This year, we are beginning the process to update the greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets for SB 375. As I mentioned earlier, these are planning targets to support reducing emissions from passenger vehicle travel. The SB 375 requires that CARB establish targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction for light-duty vehicles. It also requires that we update them at least every 8 years. The first targets were set in 2010, and we updated them in a public process that finished in 2018. This new target update should be completed in 2026 and will be applicable for 5th round SCS plans. Target levels impact the amount of effort and the investments needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts of driving for a region's sustainable community strategy. At its heart, creating plans that make it possible for people to drive less improves both climate performance and equity in a region. The targets and the target setting process are also essential ways to ensure that SB 375 contributes to the overall California climate goals as stated in the scoping plan. This will be the second time CARB is updating targets. Since the last update in 2018, there have been a great number of legislative, technological, and societal changes that may be considered in this target setting round. Some of these considerations and their relationship to regional greenhouse gas emissions from travel are clear, while others are less certain. CARB staff's work in this process will include gathering information on these factors and assessing what the net effect on targets could be. One key objective of this workshop is to start a dialogue with practitioners and the public on what trends CARB staff need to be considering for setting of these planning targets and what the trends suggest for planning of land use and transportation changes by 2035. In the next few slides, I will share some of the information that CARB staff have been involved in tracking and developing related to climate and air quality, as well as SCS implementation progress. Both will be inputs into this target update. We will probably hear more on these topics today in the panel discussion and public comment sessions. There are many sources of information and data that will be inputs to the target recommendation. Among these are the scoping plan recommendations and the SB 150 progress report, which I will discuss further in the next slides. Another essential source is MPO recommendations on the target and how it should be evaluated. These will be an important input. As part of this process, CARB staff is requesting target recommendations from all MPOs in California and hopes for recommendations and data based on MPO modeling or other information and calculations. MPOs are a key part of this process because they not only will be responsible for incorporating the targets into their plans, but also can provide data and information on what is happening in each region and what may or may not be possible in the region. In addition, CARB staff recognize that technology and society are rapidly changing. The target recommendation will incorporate the latest research on greenhouse gas reduction strategies and broader travel behavior changes that may affect emissions and driving. Among these are topics like telework and autonomous vehicles. And the final bullet here encompasses comments we receive in this process from the public, such as what we hope to receive today and other critical milestones. Public comments will be crucial to inform the recommendation and ground the process in the knowledge and aspirations of all Californians. So, one of CARB's major roles for the state is to develop a climate change scoping plan that describes the approach California will take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet its goals. The first scoping plan was approved by CARB's board in 2008 and was most recently updated in November 2022. This plan assesses progress toward California's 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target and lays out a path to achieving carbon neutrality no later than 2045. Where this work intersects with SB 375 targets is in the accounting for emissions from the transportation sector. Specifically, the scoping plan considers transportation sector emissions in three categories: technology, which is the vehicles themselves; fuels, which is the energy source used to power vehicles; and vehicle travel, measured as vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. The scoping plan shows that meeting the state's climate targets will require actions to reduce emissions coming from all three categories. The scoping plan has included sustainable community strategies since its inception as one available tool to help address emissions from the vehicle travel category, and the 2022 plan update reaffirmed the need for sustainable community strategies to address California's transportation emissions. This figure from the 2022 scoping plan shows the statewide recommended target for reducing passenger VMT per capita to achieve our climate goals. The recommendation considers the latest planning assumptions for regulations, incentives, and other policies across the many scoping plan sectors, including the regulatory and incentive work CARB has been doing to advance zero-emission vehicles in the state. The black line on the left in this graph shows observed vehicle miles traveled per person per day in California from 2010 to 2019. VMT per person was increasing, not decreasing. The green segmented line on the right shows the targeted decrease in average VMT per person needed to achieve climate goals. The goal is that compared to 2019, people will drive approximately 25% less by 2030 and 30% less by 2045. While this slide focuses on the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions from VMT and meeting our climate goals, it is important to note that CARB is also in the process of updating its mobile source strategy to help identify what strategies are needed to meet state air quality goals and are seeing a similar need to reduce VMT to meet goals for air quality and public health. CARB staff are also in charge of tracking progress in implementing sustainable community strategies across California under Senate Bill 150, which was passed in 2017. For this, CARB staff collect, analyze, and report out on over 24 metrics to help assess SCS implementation progress toward targeted reductions by region. We also survey and interview MPO staff and other practitioners to report out on the effects of recent policies, the latest SCS planning and implementation practices, and any barriers to implementation. CARB prepared the first progress report in 2018 and issued the latest report in June 2023. CARB also maintains a dashboard of data relevant to SB 150. This information provides valuable context to help understand the progress of sustainable communities, as well as barriers to their implementation. CARB staff anticipate using this information on the latest metrics, practices, and implementation barriers as key inputs to the target update process. This is the target update timeline. The seasons and years run from left to right. The labels below show key points in the timeline. The process begins this year with public comments like this meeting and with requests for information and recommendations from state partners and MPOs. In fall 2024, we will provide an informational update to the CARB board and discuss our progress to date. In early 2025, we will have another public workshop to share progress and seek comments before releasing a draft proposal in spring of 2025. Over the following year through early 2026, CARB will do additional work on the report and on the environmental analysis. In early 2026, we will release a final report and hope to have the board adopt new targets in mid-2026. These will become effective for fifth cycle SCSs, which will generally be those adopted after 2026. CARB will also do an environmental impact analysis for the target update. Ian Peterson will speak about that now. Ian?
Thanks, John. CARB is preparing a programmatic level environmental impact analysis for assessing the potential for adverse and beneficial environmental impacts associated with the target update. The analysis is prepared according to the requirements of our certified regulatory program under the California Environmental Quality Act, referred here as CEQA. The analysis will be based on the anticipated reasonably foreseeable actions undertaken by entities in response to the target update, which could have the potential to cause indirect physical changes to the environment. CARB is using the CEQA environmental checklist provided by Appendix G from the CEQA guidelines as a framework for assessing the potential for significant impacts resulting from reasonably foreseeable actions. Checklist includes criteria related to resource areas such as aesthetics, agricultural and forest resources, biological, cultural, geologic, and soil, hazards and hazardous materials, among many others. The environmental impact analysis will be included as an appendix to the staff report. Next slide, please. The analysis will include a description of the reasonably foreseeable actions that appear most likely to occur as a result of implementing the target update, the potential adverse impacts and feasible mitigation measures, and alternatives analysis. Staff welcomes public feedback on the appropriate scope and content of the analysis as it's being developed, including the reasonably foreseeable actions that may occur in response to the proposal, the potential significant adverse impacts, potential feasible mitigation measures, and feasible alternatives that the proposal could reduce or eliminate any significant adverse impacts. The draft environmental impact analysis will be released for a 45-day public review period with the staff report in 2025. And now I'll turn it over to Leslie Kimura for the panel discussion. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Ian. And I'm going to go ahead and ask our panelists to switch on their video. And just while folks are getting ready to do that, I'm going to hi everyone, I'm Leslie Kimura-Sito, and I'm the Sustainable Communities Policy Program Manager at the California Air Resources Board. I'm really happy to be here with all of you to kick off this target update process, and very excited to be moderating this Q&A session with this panel in particular. The panel theme and intent is to hear from some key perspectives on what trends are altering the outlook and planning for California's transportation and land use development future, and what changes are considered within reach by 2035, which is the target update year here. Our panel, as listed here on this slide, represents a diversity of practitioner perspectives spanning state, regional, and local planning, working at the intersection of transportation, housing, and climate in California. And I will be posing each of them 2 questions for response. The public Q&A will not be open for this session in particular, but if there are additional thoughts on topics brought up that you want CARB staff to consider, please do share them during the public comment period following this panel. And so with that, I am going to go ahead and turn to our first panelist, who is Matthew Yazgat. Matthew is Deputy Director of Programming at the California Transportation Commission. And in this role, he supports programming and allocation of funds for the construction of highway, passenger rail, transit, and active transportation improvements throughout California. The Commission also advises and assists the State Transportation Agency and Legislature in formulating and evaluating state policies and plans for California's transportation programs. So welcome, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I appreciate the invitation to participate with you all.
Yeah, thank you for making it. So I get to put you in the hot seat first, but we have 2 questions for you. I'll go ahead and read them out, and you can take them in any order you wish.
Sure.
So the first one, will be what state transportation legislative and policy changes are altering the outlook for what kind of transportation network is considered within reach by 2035? And the second question is, are there also trends in project applications or transportation funding generally that alter that outlook?
Yeah, no, thanks, Leslie. Those are very good questions. So I think I'm going to talk. I'll address your first question first. And I can say, from a policy lens, I have a few positive examples that I'd like to elaborate on. And these are all areas that interact directly with the commission and some of our colleagues that are actually on the call right now. One of the biggest policy trends that we're noticing is regarding transportation revenues. And the commission, for some of you who are not aware, the commission oversees what we refer to as the Road User Charge Technical Advisory Committee. And the road charge TAC, is what we refer to it as, is currently evaluating potential revenue neutral replacements for the gas tax. As we all know, the gas tax revenues are currently on a slight decline, but I know the expectation or the forecast is that they'll decline considerably in future years to come. And we at the commission believe that a road user charge is one mechanism that can help us maintain stable transportation revenues over time, also making it more feasible for us to reach transportation goals as we aim to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. We are also currently conducting just a bit of a status update, a second round pilot to test out how a road user charge could be implemented in the state. And that's actually being currently led by Caltrans and CalSTA. One of the other positive policy areas changes I wanted to mention is in the area of clean freight. The commission was responsible for developing a clean freight corridor efficiency assessment per Senate Bill 671, which was signed back in 2021. With the assessment, the commission, which was published by the commission last year, we identified clean priority freight corridors and provided guidance that was meant to assist the state and our partners at regional and local levels to build out the state's medium and heavy duty zero emission infrastructure needs. So this assessment is intended to guide policy changes that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and in turn improve air quality in every region across the state. And I can say one next step for the commission's assessment is one of the recommendations in the assessment has been picked up around the central delivery team, which would be kind of like a central focal point at the state agency level. And that's currently being considered by the California legislature under Senate Bill 934. With the ultimate goal of not only the assessment, but the central delivery team to support the ultimate transition to zero emission freight to coincide with CARB's regulations, advanced clean fleets, advanced clean trucks. Lastly, I want to mention the climate action plan for transportation infrastructure, which is most known as CAPTI. The commission has been a leader in implementing CAPTI, and we've outlined several key changes in our programs that have led to reduction in vehicle miles traveled and GHG reductions across the CAPTI portfolio of discretionary programs. And that's not just here at the commission, but there are several programs our sister agencies at Caltrans and CalSTA have also made to coincide with CAPTI. And lastly, I do want to talk about an area of concern because I don't want to make it seem like we're always headed in the right direction, but this is one that particularly hits close to home for us at the commission. We've seen a significant reduction in funding to the commission's active transportation program due to the ongoing budget deficit we've experienced over the last 8 to 12 months. And for those of you who are familiar with the active transportation program, it is our program that ultimately provides important funding for bike and pedestrian facilities. And each of the projects we funded last cycle all had a direct benefit or were located in disadvantaged and marginalized communities. So this is a program that is truly important not because of the types of project that it builds, but the types of benefits that it creates for our disadvantaged communities. And the reduction that the program is going to experience in the upcoming program is in the amount of $400 million, which for that program is quite substantial. I'll just move on to the second question. I know we're probably I might be running a little short on time, but what are some of the trends? I have the question in front of me. What are some of the trends that the commission or that we're seeing in project applications and transportation funding generally that may or may not alter that outlook? I would say from my vantage point, I've seen quite positive trends that I would consider encouraging in terms of the types of projects our stakeholders are submitting for funding consideration. In the area of clean freight, as I mentioned, not only with the Commission's Clean Freight Corridor Efficiency Assessment, but we've started receiving and funding significant investments in medium and heavy duty zero emission infrastructure in our Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. The last cycle, we committed over $150 million to such projects. And I would say even receiving those projects over past cycles was a positive trend that we absolutely want to see continue. And I do expect that number to climb considerably when we get to our fourth cycle, which we'll be adopting next year. Some other quick trends I'm noticing, we've seen significant strides in other programs. So the Commission's other discretionary funding programs to really, we're receiving more and funding more projects that provide alternatives to single occupancy motor vehicles. And then an example I wanted to provide was in our Solutions for Congested Corridors program, nearly 75% of the funds that we committed last cycle were committed to projects that support modes such as transit, passenger rail, and active transportation. So I see, having looked at our first cycle when SB1 was passed back in 2017, where a majority of projects were on system improvements to benefit single occupancy motor vehicles, we've kind of flipped that narrative a bit. And it's, I think through the deliberate changes that the Commission has committed to augment the program guidelines that we have. And lastly, I know our colleagues from Housing and Community Development will speak shortly, but we've also been lifting up the HCD's pro-housing designation program. A couple of the programs in my area have actually incentivized localities, so cities and counties that are either seeking pro-housing designation or preferably have actually received pro-housing designation. And I would say a good chunk of the projects we funded in our Solutions for Congested Corridors program and Local Partnership program had either sought or achieved pro-housing. And I expect we're kind of ramping it up in this next cycle where we want to see them achieve the pro-housing designation. So we're looking for projects that are coming from jurisdictions that are using efficient land use practices and considering pro-housing when they submit projects. So kind of dumped a lot there, but these are good questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Leslie.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are really great trends to highlight for folks. And I know that our CARB staff will have some follow-up questions for you, probably offline as we go through this processes. But I do want to make sure we get through our panelists because I know they also similarly have questions. So it's a bit of a taster here. We're doing speed dating, unfortunately. But next, we're going to be going over to Clay Kirchhoff and Marissa Prossi of the California Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm going to give a short intro for them. So Clay is a Climate and Transportation Manager at HCD's Policy and Program Support Unit. And here he manages policy alignment and interagency coordination on housing, climate, and transportation issues. So previous to joining HCD, I know Clay led planning and program development for California's federal disaster recovery grants and facilitated interagency coordination on hazard mitigation and recovery programs. And Marissa is a senior housing policy specialist with HCD's Fair Housing Unit, and here she specializes in topics at the intersection of fair housing, land use, and climate change. Marissa currently leads HCD's Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, efforts and serves as one of HCD's experts on affirmatively furthering fair housing. So welcome, Clay and Marissa. Very similar set of questions for you guys, but I now focused in the housing arena. So the two questions for you are, what are the changes to the state housing policy landscape since the SCS guidelines were last updated, which is around 2019, 2018 time period? And how have these housing policy changes affected trends in the housing development pipeline?
Thank you so much, Leslie, for including HCD in this important discussion and process. Marissa and I will sort of tag team the questions, so we'll answer the first one and then on to the second one. I mean, as you know, folks on this call know, the close connection between residential density, land use mix, and vehicle miles traveled are well documented. The more infill housing in lower VMT areas that can be built, the more progress we can have towards reducing per household VMT and pretty directly greenhouse gas emissions. Since CARB last updated the SCS guidelines in 2018, the state legislature has enacted over 100 pieces of housing legislation aimed at removing barriers and unlocking sites for more infill and affordable housing. So there are bills that have provided environmental or permit streamlining benefits for affordable TOD, set statewide standards for approving accessory dwelling units or ADUs, raised density bonus limits for projects with affordable units, and strengthened oversight of local governments so that they plan for and follow state housing law, and making it more difficult for compliant, infill projects to be blocked due to political opposition. It's just expanding the toolbox of, how we can build, infill housing in more places. Similarly, modifications to the sixth cycle of the regional housing needs allocation led to a significantly higher estimate of projected housing need across California regions, and this process has resulted in increased zone capacity within existing communities, such that denser multifamily and affordable infill projects are now feasible in areas where they previously were not. And my colleague Marissa will speak to the changes in the sixth and upcoming RENA cycles after me. But Matthew, we appreciate the shout out to the Pro Housing Designation Program. We think it's been a big success. And HCD has adopted permanent regulations for the program, and now 47 jurisdictions across the state have the designation. So pro housing policies that make it easier to build, infill development, near jobs and daily destinations. This can include things like reducing impact fees, promoting housing types that reduce cost, reducing parking requirements, having pre-approved plans for ADUs and missing middle housing types, providing local housing trust funds, providing grants and low interest loans for ADUs, land donations, among other strategies. There are different ways a jurisdiction could get a pro housing designation, but statewide in aggregate, all of these actions are designed to accelerate infill development and enable a more compact development pattern, which has the dual benefit of addressing California's dire housing shortage, but also having the benefit of having positive climate impacts. Given the timelines of housing development and housing market cycles, the aforementioned policies take time to yield results. However, there have been positive measurable impacts on construction starts with certain housing types, especially ADUs. Where we're at now is essentially California has a much larger universe of potential projects and sites that have been unlocked. And these projects on the whole can contribute significantly to reducing household VMT. So, as the state housing department, we're hopeful that as the SCS guidelines are updated, it would be helpful to capture these changes to California's housing policy landscape. Because building more dense infill housing and making it less expensive and easier to build this type of housing is not only a crucial housing strategy, but a critical climate strategy as well. So now I'll pass it on to my colleague, Melissa, to discuss the critical importance of the regional housing needs allocation process in these efforts.
Great, thanks, Clay. Happy to be tag teaming this with you. So I'm here to talk about how this really zooming in on RENA and how RENA can, the changes in that since 2018. So when we compare to where we were in 2018 and where we were in the 5th RENA cycle, the 6th RENA cycle has marked an important shift in how and where we plan for housing across the state. At a high level, there are 3 big changes I'll highlight today. The state has improved how we estimate the demand and need for housing. We've improved where we plan for that housing. And the state has supported those, significant policy changes with close to $1 billion in planning grant funding for local and regional governments, in addition to the billions invested into the development of affordable housing. The 6th cycle regional housing needs determination process, or what I like to refer to as the creation of the big housing need number for each region, made important adjustments so that the state is more accurately capturing the true housing needs of our state, as we previously had not done the best job of accounting for the pent-up housing demand that exists across the state from families and households doubled up or cost burden. That's the size of the determination there. In addition, other changes to the allocation portion of the RENA process, or what I like to refer to as how that big housing need number is divvied up to local governments in a region, ensured that the RENA would be allocated to communities in a manner that furthers the 5 statutory objectives of RENA, which focus on creating housing in infill locations near jobs, at a variety of densities and affordability, and that provide access to opportunity. These 5 objectives are kind of the guiding light of RENA and are a really succinct distillment of the state's land use and housing and planning goals. It's still a little bit too early to see the full extent of the impacts of these policies, but some early indicators of success are the widespread rezonings and other policy changes that are currently happening across the state that are making higher density housing possible in infill locations. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that HCD recently published our California's Housing Future 2040, the next RENA report, a couple months ago, which puts forward a series of recommendations to the legislature, as well as plan changes under HCD's existing administrative authority to improve the RENA process and methodology for next time, for the 7th cycle and onwards. We continue to iterate, and so these recommendations build on the early success of the 6th cycle, but make adjustments to better account for the amount of housing needed across the state and to better ensure that housing is being planned for in areas that are in line with the state's climate, economic, and equity goals. Included in those recommendations are strategies to better align the RTP SCS and RENA process to make sure our regional planning efforts are planning for the same future, and a future that adequately houses all Californians, furthers our equity goals, and does so in a manner that reduces VMT and GHG, with things like providing the determination earlier so it can be incorporated into the RTP SCS forecasted development pattern, making sure the RTP SCS and RENA are planning for existing housing needs and projected housing needs, and better aligning the RTP SCS and RENA goals in general. One other major change since 2018 is in terms of the state's investments in planning grants to regional and local governments. So prior to my current role at HCD on the Fair Housing team, alongside the partnership of CARB, OPR, and SGC, I led HCD's efforts to design the Regional Early Action Planning Grants of 2021, or REAP 2.0. And so I'm always happy to provide kudos to state planning grants efforts with many partners on the call today. So all of those RENA changes to RENA and policy and program updates that I mentioned have in turn been supported by an unprecedented investments by the state over the last 5 years in the form of planning grants to regional and local governments to unlock new housing and make the RENA goals achievable, with an emphasis on infill locations and affirmatively furthering fair housing, just in a way that hadn't happened before. And so that significant shift in planning requirements has been paired with, nearly $1 billion in assistance to local and regional governments via the SB2, REAP 1.0 and REAP 2.0 programs. And then just to close on this question, when we think back to 2018, and how we might update our outlook for what is possible by 2035. A truly remarkable number of changes have happened in the housing policy space across the state, as Clay mentioned. We have a lot to say on this topic together, in part because the legislature and governor have made a whole series of changes to how we approach housing policy and what kinds of levers are available to unlock more housing. And just one hallmark of that, the sense of scale of changes. In 2018, the housing policy development team at HCD, where Clay and I both sit, I believe had under 20 staff. And the last number I heard was we have over 130 in just 6 years. And so that significant growth is a marker of how much more work the legislature has given our team over the last few years to address housing as an issue in their state. And we're excited to see the fruits of those labors in the form of improving housing development trends, both in terms of how much housing is being built, but where it's being built.
Exactly. And to, answer the second part, how have these housing policy changes affected trends in the housing development pipeline? This information is, easier to track and is publicly available in large part to HCD's open data tools and the local annual progress report dashboard. And it allows us to, track permit, construction, completion data across local governments, across regions, and across the state. And while there are other factors that result in project completion, we do see increased applications for entitlement, permit, and construction. So just some high-level figures across total housing activity. Completed residential construction is up 13% from 2022 to 2023, and construction is up every year 6 years in a row from 2018. Multifamily activity in 2023 across the 5-year development pipeline is at 308,000 units, which is above the previous 5-year average of 278,000 units. Also, we're building more housing for lower income Californians. So in 2018, lower income units accounted for 9% of total permitted units and 7% of total completed units. But by 2023, the share of lower income units increased to 19% of all permitted and 16% of completed. Furthermore, the development timeline has shortened at all stages of the process. So from application to entitlement to permitting to completion. It is a shrinking timeline across the past 5 years. We also have some data that demonstrates that housing is increasingly being permitted and planned for in lower VMT and high quality transit areas. Based on some preliminary analysis of Orange County, we see increased percentage of units in high quality transit areas across time from a baseline in 2016 to units permitted 2018 through 2021. And then of the site inventory units from the most recent local housing element updates looking out through 2030. So across these 3 periods of time, the percentage of overall units in Orange County in these high quality transit areas rose from 28% to 36% to 44%. And this corresponds with a reduced VMT, average annual VMT per household across these periods as well, from 17,000 miles to 16,000 miles to 15,900 miles in the final kind of forward-looking site inventory units. Capturing the climate benefits of different build-out scenarios will be important. And these preliminary data suggests that the more aggressive infill housing development results in greater per household VMT reductions. But getting closer to meeting RHNA targets and our SCS goals is in large part dependent on the quality of regional and local housing plans, which I'll now hand it over to Marissa to speak more on.
Thanks, Clay. So I think there's some really impressive and promising signs from the AP annual progress report data and site inventory data. So I'm going to just speak a little bit about the housing plans of looking beyond those. What are our plans planning for? At the state and regional level, As I mentioned, updates to the 6th RENA cycle process marked a significant change, and we're trying to build on that progress with the recommendations laid out in our California's Housing Future 2040 report. Just to share a few examples, but highly recommend taking a look at the report, or at least the executive summary of it, which is available on our RENA webpage at HCD. But just a few of those changes that we're planning for. Previously the RENA process didn't fully plan for the long-term permanent housing needs of people experiencing homelessness. And we're going forward, we're trying to address that and fix that. We've also enhanced how we consider jobs housing adjustment in the determination process. To not just focus on how many people need homes as a result of jobs in a region to avoid things like super commuters, but at what income levels those are needed. And this will help the state plan for housing in accordance to where it is needed to reduce commute lengths, particularly for low-income workers. In addition, previously the determination didn't really account for homes lost to short-term rentals or vacation homes. And so we're making changes in the 7th cycle to account for that in our determination number. That and a host of other refinements that should better focus our housing planning efforts. As for housing plans at the local level, when comparing the 6th to the 5th cycle, there have been a number of impactful changes to housing elements in the 6th cycle, where many local governments are now required to identify more realistic sites for future development and pair those more realistic sites with thoughtful programs and updated land use requirements to unlock infill development. So we know that there are success stories across the state, but it's still a bit too early in the 6th cycle to comment on the extent of that success at the state level, as many local governments have not yet completed their 6th cycle rezonings just yet. But the good news is that the rezonings are happening and happening at a widespread level. By one account, a paper out of UCLA noted that in the SCAG region, as of February 2023, the 93 municipalities that were in compliance with their housing elements had committed to over 10 times the amount of rezoning than in the previous planning period in the 5th cycle in 2014. So more than 500,000 units in those 93 municipalities compared to 50,000 units across the whole state in 2014. And importantly, that those rezonings are happening in places that are more likely to redevelop. Again, a smaller sample size of our whole state. We're going to learn more in the next couple of years, but some promising signs. And in hopefully a couple of years, we'll have a better sense of the extent to which all of these 6th cycle housing element changes have helped achieve state housing goals and change land use development patterns, and if how much the state may need to further adjust to meet housing and climate goals as we continue to iterate. So like I said, while data is incomplete, there's some really promising signs between what's in the plans as well as the annual progress report data that Clay mentioned. And we're excited to see those housing trends in the direction they're going.
Super excited to get the preview on those trends. Thank you so much, Marissa and Clay. And we look forward to trying to figure out how we incorporate that in our target setting processes. All right, now moving from state folks on to regional folks, I will be introducing Tueri Faola, who is Deputy Director of Sustainable Communities with the San Diego Association of Governments, also known as SANDAG, which is the MPO and Council of Governments that brings together local decision makers to develop regional solutions across San Diego County. Now, in this position, she does help lead the policy and technical teams in development of the region's sustainable community strategy. Welcome, Tueri. And I know that I'm giving you 2 questions now because I know SANDAG is actually now in process of developing its 4-cycle SCS. So what trends are you seeing in this work, and how are they affecting basically your region's planning for what's considered within reach by 2035? And then, I know also been around the SCS world for a while. So what do you see as the regional plan policies or investments that can be most impactful for advancing these climate-friendly land use and transportation solutions?
Well, thank you, Leslie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel and for the questions that you've given me. I think the thing is 2035. It is very close for our region completing our 4th SCS cycle. That's only 10 years away, so it's not a lot of time when we think about it to really advance our projects or to be able to meet our SB 375 GHG target. And I'd say what we're seeing as trends, and honestly, what we're being asked for by our advocates, our policymakers, and others is what are the types of projects and policies that really can be implemented in that short term? Because the larger major transportation projects and land use changes, while they're very important and we're working towards planning for all of those, they take a long time to implement and to really realize the impacts. So we've been focused on projects that are more implementable in that short term, like our bus rapid transit type of projects, really looking at services that we call in the Sandag region flexible fleets. This is our on-demand microtransit, neighborhood electric vehicles, clean transportation type of vehicles that can operate, as well as bike share and other things. But both transit as well as flexible fleets, they require the support and coordination with our local cities if we're going to be able to implement those. But I will say our region has had a lot of success with implementing flexible fleets. You know, we have a history of being able to implement rapid transit throughout the region, but flexible fleets is a newer area that we've been implementing since, you know, for the last couple of years. We have 11 electric neighborhood electric vehicles, as well as microtransit that's currently operating throughout the region. 3 of those are supported by Sandag as the regional partner, helping to keep those projects moving along. And then others have really been supported and as well as funded by some of our local cities, as well as our transit operators. And we're working on launching several more here in the near future. But one thing I would mention in terms of like, you know, that's a great trend that we've seen here as we've been preparing for our 4th cycle. And it's a super popular in terms of the flexible fleets. It's really popular throughout our region, with many of the cities asking us to help them to launch new services like that throughout their city, really facilitating that first and last mile between transit and shorter trips throughout the region. But while it has that political and that local support, our modeling tools, when we're really focused on what we can do for our SB 375 target, our modeling tools are not showing that that type of service makes a huge impact when it comes to reducing VMT the way that other policies and projects might help us to do that. So it's something we're really focused on, and we're seeing gaining a lot of support, but we're really still saying we need more than that to hit our targets. I think the other thing that we've really seen in our 4th cycle, and that has been something that we're trying to make sure that we're explaining and really being, you know, forthcoming with how we're talking about our SCS, is as we've been preparing our 4th cycle one, we have seen a change with our regional forecast, and we're not showing in our forecast as much growth as we've seen in prior cycles. And so when we're looking at how our region is going to grow from population as well as housing, it's been really difficult to explain how we're showing slower growth and we're not seeing as much housing need in our forecast that we do for the SCS compared to our region is completed and our housing elements for our cities have been updated for the 6th cycle of RHNA. And so really trying to talk about the differences between those 2 documents and how they sync up and the needs and the requirements. And I think to what Marissa was talking about earlier, and, you know, all the data that goes into developing the regional housing needs assessment compared to the data that goes into developing our SCS. So we're really trying to work very hard at explaining the differences between the 2, especially since our forecast is showing lower, not as much growth as we had anticipated in prior plans. But I will say when we were developing our 3rd cycle SCS and we hadn't quite gotten through our RHNA cycle, we had a really aggressive land use pattern that was very helpful to us in helping to achieve some of our targets that we had for SB 375 and our GHG and VMT reduction. And so what we have seen as we've now started preparing our 4th, you know, SCS cycle is that, you know, the new laws that, you know, HCD was talking about that have come forward, as well as I think, you know, also the efforts that we did in collaborating and working with the cities around our SCS and regional goals. As we're now moving forward with our 4th cycle SCS, we're actually not seeing that land use is going to be, and aggressive land use policies is going to be one of the major policy shifts for developing this 4th cycle one. More of our cities, especially in the urbanized areas where they're planning for future growth, is very much in alignment with what we want to see for where we're planning for our transportation investments. And so it's, you know, I guess the good and the bad, it's great because we've seen that. And then we also have the challenge as the regional entity in trying to figure out what are those projects and policies and things that are helping us to hit our GHG reduction. And I guess I'll go ahead and transition to the second question around policy, since I already started touching on that with the land use housing component. But I'd say for those policies that we think are very impactful for helping us to meet, climate and transportation goals, for our region, we do look at transit and look at different types of policies that are supportive to transit and how that helps us. We also have a really successful electric vehicle and charging infrastructure incentive program that helps us. And we've seen that be very successful in our region, particularly in our prior cycle. But then I think the one thing that, has already been mentioned in this call, so I'm glad I'm not the first one bringing it up, is related to pricing policies and really how pricing helps us and being able to achieve that. And then the only other thing is I would say is related to funding. So when it comes to transit, when we're looking at transit, things that we've really seen as policies that help to support the infrastructure is increasing the transit frequency. So how often the bus can come, it makes a big difference in being competitive to people driving. Really looking at how long are we offering our transit service? Is it operating longer and really covering some of those later non-typical traditional work shifts to allow transit to be a viable option for people to use it? And then really thinking about how we might offer, more reduced fares or even free transit for, if it's not all, but certain populations. And those kind of things really help us in seeing an increase in transit ridership and really reducing the amount of VMT, which, the VMT helps us in how we're measuring to be able to achieve our GHG targets. And we have seen success in these types of programs when we've increased frequencies, when we have launched a youth opportunity pass here in the San Diego region, and we saw our ridership numbers go up significantly through the use of that program. And so we want to be able to implement more like that. But again, really focused on, for our region, what we can do in the near term, because we are looking at only that 10-year time frame. And, I mentioned funding as one of those aspects as kind of like a key. While it's not necessarily a policy lever, I do want to mention that funding is a really critical part of us being able to do some of these policies, because as I mentioned, those transit improvements, there's not really, though, a really great funding stream for us to be able to implement that. And so we do need maintenance and operation funds to be able to cover that increase in service hours, those increase in frequencies, and different funding to offer more free transit opportunities for those who need it most here in our community, if not for all. And so really, those are the kind of things that we see when we're talking about transit and the policies that are very impactful, but we're really lacking in the funding to be able to do that. There's plenty of funding for us to go out there and think about how we might actually build it and compete for that, but there's not really the funding when it ties in the operations that makes that, structure that you build or that infrastructure very successful. Another area that was successful for us, I think really more, in our prior cycle and something that we continue to invest in is when it comes to electric vehicles and really providing those incentive programs and helping people with that transition. We have a really great, rebate program, and ours is focused on how we can also look at some of our low income communities who don't have charging infrastructure as readily available in their communities to help them to make that transition. And so this is something that we want to continue to look at in our fourth cycle. It's not something that I would say in the fourth cycle, based on new guidance that we've gotten and looking at what the state and the feds are doing, that we can take a lot of credit for. But it is something that, again, when you're just talking about like GHG, this is something that's really helpful in terms of a policy that we can support. And when we were doing our third cycle for our SCS, we got almost 2% of our reduction. Our target in the San Diego region is 19% reduction. And about 2% of that was done through our EV program. So while we don't think we're going to be able to get the same amount of credit for it in our fourth cycle, it is something that we still think is an important policy. Again, it's difficult when we're talking about what we can get as much credit for in the policy perspective to elected leaders and to the public, and is saying this is really great for us to make the investment and we want to continue to do that. But also knowing that these are really impactful policies and we want to see those continue to keep moving forward in our plans and in our region. And then the last thing that I'll mention is, again, related to pricing. The San Diego region, we had previously proposed a road usage charge in our third cycle of our SCS, and we did have our SCS later amended to remove that. But we're really happy to see the state is actually taking a role in advancing how we look at the replacement of the gasoline tax, because that's important. And we want to make sure that we are, following kind of the state's, guidance and lead on that. And so we're not necessarily proposing to do anything different than the state, but I think that's one of those policies that we look forward to seeing the state's continued leadership on that moving forward and helping us to reduce VMT and also just really capturing all of those users who are using the roadway. But while we, in our fourth cycle of our SCS are not necessarily focused as much on a road usage charge, we do have other what we consider like pricing strategies in our plan that are really important. And one of those that I believe I saw in one of the Q&As that someone mentioned is about parking pricing. And that is a very impactful and helpful policy for us to be able to move forward, especially when it's coupled together and you're looking at areas where it's transit and it's land use and housing. That's really an effective policy, we think, with advancing climate and transportation goals. But again, like I think one of the things that we want to, reiterate as a regional agency, implementing these kind of policies really do require local support. And it's an area where we're really reliant on working with our locals and in partnering with them and helping them to see how they can implement this so that we can make sure that these, policies actually are impactful and are moved forward in our region. And we probably don't have time to talk about this fully in our time today, but I think when we're talking about pricing strategies, the one thing that continues to come up in the discussion in our region is around equity and how do we embed equity into the discussion and understanding who's being impacted and who's not. We have a robust managed lanes strategy that we're using as well in our fourth cycle. We use that as in our prior cycle, and we see that as a great opportunity to still continue to say, this is a way that we can advance using existing infrastructure that's out there, but we can use it in a way that helps us to say, can we prioritize transit so that we can make sure that if we are getting those increased frequencies and we are getting longer hours of operation, that they have reliable service? Can we make sure that we can incentivize people to use carpooling more often on those roadways? And, and if we do want to, maybe we price some of those facilities. And, when you start talking about pricing, you inevitably also start talking about equity. And I won't say that we have the solutions to that, but we're certainly having the conversations and talking about it a bit more here in the San Diego region. So those are, I guess I'll kind of end there as far as those are some of the policies that we think are really impactful. But, again, wanting to emphasize that a lot of the policies that we put forward really rely on collaboration. As a regional entity, we're really heavily reliant upon collaboration with our partner agencies and really with the local cities. And we really are, just looking for all types of funding to help us to implement that. Thank you so much, HCD, with the funding that we had through the REAP program. That was been really critical, and we're just ecstatic about being able to continue to implement that program moving forward. But since it's a one-time funding source, we really do want to see something like that or others, brought forward to help us to continue with the implementation of our SCS and really making these policies that we talk about a reality.
Thank you, Tamari. I appreciate you highlighting those strategies and the trends you guys are seeing, and also the connection between the funding pieces. Very crucial for all of us to talk about that across the different agencies. All right, now we're going to go on to have me introduce Christine Kai. So Christine and I go way back, but now she's Director of Mobility for Central and Northern California at LSA. When she and I first met, I know she was working at Fresno COG. She's currently advising Fresno COG and also a number of other Valley MPO, so Madera, I think San Joaquin Council of Governments, as well as Merced, on their SCS related work. And before, basically, she was working as really at the helm, I think, of Fresno COG for about 21 years in helping to really oversee the development of the last 3 sustainable community strategies for the region. And there she led a team of both engineers, planners, and implementing the projects and programs there to advance sustainability in the region. And so Christine is, I know, a well-recognized expert in the Valley on these transportation strategy and planning and policy development work and VMT strategy and mitigation. So very glad to have you here, Christine. Welcome. Your set of questions is very similar to the ones that I sent over to Tueri, but being at the helm of really developing SCSs in the Fresno region and now supporting the work for a number of other Valley MPOs as they move into their fourth cycle. I mean, what trends are you seeing moving forward in this work? And, how are you thinking about what's considered within reach by 2035? And are there actual regional plan policies, investments that you would highlight as the most impactful for advancing this work?
Well, thank you, Leslie, so much for inviting me to be on this panel. So my work has been in the Valley. So what I'm going to talk about, really is based on my experience. It might or might not apply to the other regions. But after listening to Terry and then other state folks, I did notice that there are some common trends that all the MPOs are experiencing or have experienced, and there are some common issues that the MPOs in the Valley are experiencing with the rest of the MPOs in the state. So first one, I want to start off with the population forecast, of course. In the last, I would say 2 cycles at least, and including this one, at least 3 cycles, the MPOs in the Valley have seen a shrink. Their population forecast has been shrinking, which is something that, of course, it's not under control by the MPOs, but it definitely posed a big challenge for the MPOs to really reach the target that ARB set for them. Because, in 2018, when ARB sets the target, a lot of MPOs really made target recommendation to ARB and using the forecast available at that time, right? But, since then, the forecast has been shrunk considerably. And the MPOs really has less population, which means less housing to really work with. The way the GHG target works is really in the Valley, the land use pattern right now is pretty spread out. And really the way that, it's going to, for the Valley MPO be able to reach the target, land use is a big strategy, really. And we need the housing really in the future to have higher density, really to kind of offset the spread out pattern, in order to get to the desired density, therefore, reaching the target. But with less and less housing unit to play with, given the shrinked population forecast, this is going to be an issue. So I think, in the coming up cycle of the target setting, I think that issue needs to be addressed. Population forecast, how is it going to be factored into the target setting and the SCS development? So interestingly, of course, I've noticed that the RENA numbers that at least Fresno COG received for the 6th cycle. It's really for the next 8 years, but compared to the entire housing or households, new households in the next 20-something years, it seems like the next 8 years in the RENA numbers accounts for the big, huge majority of the housing that the entire SCS is looking at. So, it's kind of, to me, it's disproportional in terms of the housing development over the next, until the horizon year in the Valley is close to 2050. So we'll have to really reconcile that kind of, I think, RENA numbers, happening in the, it's a huge number happening in the first 8 years of the next, over the RTP time period. So that's one common, I think that we noticed too, as well as, as pointed out by Tori from Sandag. So for the Valley, I think another trend that the Valley MPOs, the Valley region has been experiencing is really the warehousing jobs. We're getting a lot of distribution centers and a lot of jobs therefore come with such distribution centers. And then we all know such distribution centers cannot really be located in the more urban core areas. Of course, they have to be in the industrial park, which is mostly in the outskirts of towns, and which, you know, translates to longer commute for people who, you know, are going to work at such distribution centers. And for the valley, of course, compared to the rest of the states, you know, the valley, you know, has another huge priority, you know, that everybody wants to really address is the economic development. You know, historically, the valley really has much higher unemployment rate. Poverty level is much higher than the rest of the state. So jobs are badly needed in the valley. So although in the jobs that comes to such warehousing centers, distribution centers, they probably are longer, you know, commute. But I think there are ways to address that. You know, those jobs will be able to get people out of poverty, address the employment issues. So, you know, VMT, although, you know, probably longer VMT, but then we can really you know, look at converting the VMT to green or cleaner VMT. Actually, you know, a lot of valley regions are really start addressing that. So that's the kind of the bigger trend I want to kind of touch on. But then, you know, since I talk about the warehousing jobs and goods movement, you know, the trend, I think, you know, strategy-wise or policy-wise, the valley MPOs and then the county, the entire region are really looking at effective strategies that will address the issues. Although, you know, trucks are not necessarily part of the what SB 375 addresses, but still it's related to air quality. And then, but the commute, you know, the VMT that coming from those distribution centers is part of SB 375. So right now, the valley, a lot of the regions in the valley are looking at, you know, the potential of developing inland ports, and which really, by definition, is really to really, you know, transport goods from the ports via rail into the valley, via inland ports in the valley, and then distribute those ports to the market via clean trucks. So this is something I think I heard the MTC and Matthew also mentioned that the state is really trying to focus on clean freight, which I'm really excited to hear about. And then also, you know, I think the state has been very supportive of these efforts in the valley. You know, valley-wide, there you know, the regions, some of the regions are more advanced. They already have, you know, sites selected. They already have agreement reached with the rail companies, and some regions are, you know, are in the process of selecting sites that have grants from the state and then from the federal government. And then this is not just for goods movement. It's really looking at, you know, developing like, you know, green jobs too. You know, we're going to at that inland port. It's not just distribution of goods. We are looking at, you know, having clean transportation technology, and even, you know, down the road, it could be a trade zone for more clean and advanced, you know, high-tech jobs for the valley. So there's a lot of movement on this piece. I think it's something that, you know, I'm really hopeful that this is going to address a lot of issues potentially, you know, in terms of jobs issues, and then, you know, improve quality, even not just for the valley, statewide, to address clean freight. And then in terms of other effective strategies that, you know, I have noticed, you know, in my experience, you know, I also oversee the modeling group when I was at Fresno COG in the last several cycles of SCS development. You know, I always notice, and I'm sure other MPOs have the same experience, the land use strategy is always given the biggest bang of the buck. kind of small changes in the land use allocation, produce big VMT changes. So, but then how can we really, we can really plan, but then how can we really make sure that that's implemented on the ground? So for the Valley, I think it's harder because, a lot of the cities, the bigger cities in the Valley, they really have good plans developed, downtown plans, a lot of good transit-oriented development plans developed for high quality transit corridor like BRT corridors. Those plans are in place, zoning has been done, and planning, permitting process is being streamlined, and they're just waiting for development to come in. But the reality is it's harder for the Valley because financially it's really hard to pencil out, because for the downtown and infill and redevelopment areas, it's always, it's smaller parcels, it's harder to assemble bigger pieces of development, right? And then the infrastructure needs to be upgraded in order to accommodate the higher density development, like the water, the sewage system. And then thirdly, if we're looking at higher density, more than 3-floor structure, you will be looking at, steel structure, you'll be looking at elevators. These are all, more expensive building types. So really it's very expensive, more expensive than regular housing development in the infill and redevelopment area. But in the Valley, the income structure, people incomes are relatively lower salary-wise than the rest of the state. It's really hard for people to afford such housing, if it's market rate. So that's why, all the planning, I think a lot of planning has been done, but it's just harder for those housing or development to come in. And really, what could work, right? We always talk about the redevelopment money that went away. So it did, when it was around, a lot of developers was able to take advantage of that money to help with the infill and redevelopment money projects. So I really don't know what's the prospect of having the redevelopment money come back, but definitely, funding, getting more funding, to support infill and redevelopment, it's very helpful. And I know the Valley MPOs and the region appreciate HCD's REAP dollars. Everybody, I think all the regions, appreciate such funding, but it will be great if REAP could be a regular funding source to help out with such a, housing that will actually, support housing and reduce VMT and GHG. So, the last point I want to make is really, to the Valley, we kind of, there are studies that done by different entities that look at transit strategy in the Valley. And, it's really different from the urban area like the Bay Area or San Diego or Southern California, where really the land use is pretty spread out. That's the fact, though, that's something that's really needed for transit to work. So the, fixed route transit, the Valley has tried really, really hard to get the fixed route transit to work. Actually, a lot of local sales measures fund those fixed route transit. But, really, because the spread out pattern of the land use in the Valley, a lot of agencies in the Valley are starting to explore alternative transit, such as, the community-based ride share programs and microtransit. Just, these are the alternative transit strategies that I think probably can help down the road to help those people living in the rural areas that don't really have their own vehicle, but they need to really get to their job, go to the doctors, go to do shopping in the regional centers. But these are the long distance, trips, VMTs. fixed route transit couldn't help them. But I think, down the road, when we figure out a good mechanism, those alternative transit strategies, it's looking promising to me down the road. But of course, funding is another critical, issue. If we can get more funding to support that kind of transit strategy, there's never enough funding, right? I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. But with that, Leslie, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I really appreciate your insights, especially working so broadly in the Valley and making the points of like what is unique in that particular context as well. I appreciate that. And now moving on to our local representative, Matt Hertel, who is the Long Range Planning Manager with the City of Sacramento. I know Matt's team is working on several exciting initiatives, including implementing the recently adopted 2040 General Plan and Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, implementing their 2021 to 2029 housing element, as well as undertaking zoning code revisions to allow multi-unit dwelling by right in all neighborhood zones. So in 2021, I know the Sacramento's Planning Division was awarded the Planning Agency Award of Excellence by the American Planning Association in California. And so pleased to have Matt here to give us some perspective on how the local dynamic works in really, I think making the connection between a lot of these state and regional policies on the ground. So Matt, are there particular regional plan policies or investments that can really help to advance these climate-friendly land use and transportation solutions at the local level? And what changes are you considering within reach by 2035?
Great. Thank you, Leslie. And good evening to you and all for staying with us. I'll keep it upbeat. And thanks for those local jurisdictions represented on here. So just a little bit about Sacramento, what's behind me, and that's not a green screen, that's the real city there. We've got a population of about 530,000. We are, our metropolitan planning organization is the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG for short. I know a couple of representatives are on, so thank you, SACOG. Covers 6 counties and 22 cities. And here in Sacramento, obviously SB 375 was signed into law in 2008, and we've been tracking where are we putting our growth, how are we doing? And between 2008 and 2022, 63% of the city's housing units have been infill, compared to 37% in new growth areas. And so this includes the period of growth for the Sacramento region, where a good portion of our north area of the city, called North Atoma, is built out. And so, looking at how we're going to grow, by 2040, we are anticipated to grow by 66,000 additional housing units and 77,000 jobs. We're one of the fastest growing big cities in California. And this housing growth mirrors the growth assumed in SACOG's current Metropolitan Transportation Plan or Sustainable Community Strategy, MTP-SCS. So in February of this year, the Sacramento City Council adopted the 2040 General Plan and Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, or CAP for short, that's a mouthful. And these plans really double down on infill and increasing the amount of housing near transit and jobs. And it includes ambitious and groundbreaking policies and actions. But how do we know that these policies and actions are going to be enough to help our region meet the SB 375 GHG reduction targets and ultimately for the city to get to carbon neutrality by 2045? Well, we set aggressive but achievable targets and established key indicators to be tracked annually. So these are things that you all are very familiar with. It's mode share, it's vehicle miles traveled per capita, it's in the percentage of development that is infill and along our corridors and centers, consistent with the MTP-SCS, and we have very aggressive goals on that. In terms of some recommendations and regional plans of policy investments, I recommend, if you can, to align your general plan and your CAP updates with your MPO's MTP-SCS. There's a lot of benefits there. We like I said, we mirror that projected growth, and there's a lot of synergy between what SACOG is doing and how they're approaching it and how the city is. I mean, considering that the city is basically anticipated to take care of a third of the growth for the whole 6-county region, 28 city. I mean, we are an important part of that, right? We're the job center, we're the transportation center of the entire region. So we take that responsibility very seriously. And, with that alignment, you can, pursuant to, of course, SB 375 and 743, as discussed earlier, streamlined SEEK reviews available to projects located in transit priority areas and consistent with the SES. We use that all day long. And so it's a really important part of our streamlining. We have a number of streamlining initiatives. We have a citywide master EIR. We have other things, but that's a big important part of that. And then when you're looking to update a general plan and cap, and we're a little bit unique, we actually do it every 5 years. We're crazy, but we do it every 5 years to stay with these trends, to stay in sync with the MTPSCS and everything else going on with the state. But when updating these two documents, really take advantage of the opportunity to enact significant policies and try to make these policies effective immediately. You avoid that subsequent work and avoid that subsequent controversy by talking about it. We're going to do this someday, and then go through the details. Do it while you're going. Also adopt specific plans in key growth areas of jurisdiction. So, get you further CEQA streamlining, such as statutory exemptions. Really important piece of this, as everyone's been talking about, is money. So it's about finance plans and impact fee districts to pay for the infill infrastructure you need to build the housing where you need it. We have 7 active specific plans in Sacramento. So highly encourage that. Previously mentioned, become a pro-housing jurisdiction. So in 2022, the city of Sacramento actually became the first jurisdiction in the state to be awarded the pro-housing. It has paid benefits for us. We've received $2.5 million directly from the Pro-Housing Incentive Pilot Grant Program for affordable housing in infill areas, but also increased lots of points and our ability to gain more dollars from the state and all the statewide grant applications. So definitely take a look at that. I also want to highlight something I think that's unique to our region and is a great example of ingenuity and creativity of MPOs. So shout out to SACOG developing a program that you may have heard of called Green Means Go. It allocates state funding such as REAP 2.0, et cetera, to pay for underground infrastructure that creates more infill housing, increases mobility, reduces vehicle emissions, and funding is directed to locally nominated green zones. So they overlap with the MTPSCS infill areas, green zones, and our own. And those are, areas that cities and counties identified for infill development. And to date, SACOG has allocated about $34 million to underground infrastructure. I mean, there's really no other funding source for this. We talked about loss of redevelopment. Well, this is a unique funding source to help do that. We, for City of Sacramento, has received 13 million of that 34. And we're using it right now for underground infrastructure and storm drainage facilities in really key infill areas, like a river district. And then in terms of, what changes are considered within reach by 2035, well, some of the recommendations I have, I'm going to throw out there. It may not be applicable to all jurisdictions, but things for you to consider. And these are all things that City of Sacramento has already done. So under land use, remove your minimum parking requirements jurisdiction-wide. It's no longer a debate. Go do it. Get it done. Instead, focus on parking management, shared use agreements, transportation demand management strategies. Get rid of that requirement that adds a lot of dollars to housing and takes away a lot of land for housing. One thing that is, I think we're one of the first, if not the first in the state, but moving away from your maximum density standards. And for those who aren't familiar with a lot of land use talk, it's the number of units per acre. So jurisdictions everywhere say you can only do X number of units per acre. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Really need to move over to that floor area ratio, focusing on the size of the box. So different size of boxes are appropriate in different areas of the city, sure, but it's really about not the number of units within that box, but the size of the box. So it allows for a lot more flexibility, a lot more units, micro units, all that. So that's something I recommend. Lean fully into missing middle housing. We call it neighborhood scale multi-unit dwellings. So starting in October, we'll be the first in the state to allow significant multi-unit housing in single-family neighborhoods. So you can build at least 10 units per lot, at least. So that's the smaller lots within half mile walking distance of high frequency transit, and at least 6 units per lot for the smaller lots in any neighborhood further away from transit. We also followed Portland, Oregon as the second city in the country to limit the size of single family homes. So in Sacramento, your average lot size can't build anything larger than 2,000 square feet. If you want to build more, you've got to add a second unit. So really incentivize. You want to add more, you got to do a third unit, and all the way up. Really incentivizing those smaller units, more lower cost, and those units that are already established infrastructure, but near transit, near jobs, near the best schools and parks, et cetera. Really moving towards that affirmatively further and fair housing the HCD talked about earlier. Definitely increase the amount of housing allowed substantially within a half mile walking distance of transit. really using that half mile metric instead of as a crow flies, that walking distance. So the infrastructure, if you add more infrastructure, that walking distance becomes closer. So it's a better metric for that. And then I'm winding down here, but on the transportation and mobility side of things, moving towards prioritizing your planning, your dollars, your pavement, all that on prioritize walk first, then biking, then public transit over the automobile. We call that the modal hierarchy. A small little thing to do is take another look at your street design standards. Most of our lanes are way too wide. Ours are. We're looking at hopefully to narrow those things down, more room for active transportation, more room for street trees and climate solutions. Another easy one, road diet everywhere that you can that won't result in absolute gridlock. So we have done a lot of road diets, putting an opportunity for public transit, bikes, all the protected bike lanes. But through our general plan, we identified another 35 roadway segments that we cleared through environmental to road diet. And then finally, protect your land uses around transit. Since 2018, we passed a transit-oriented development ordinance. We prohibit autocentric uses within walking distance of transit. And we double down on that through our general plan, adding bus to our light rail. So that's really important because once you build that land use, that auto shop, the drive-through, it's going to be there for forever, 55 years, right? And so you really need to protect that land for housing near that transit. And that's it.
That's not it. That's so great, Matt. Thank you for all I just can't believe how many rich solutions you got through in less than 7 minutes. Thank you. I just want to say, one, very, very appreciative of all of you panelists and sticking with us today. And for folks who have listened, I'm so appreciative of the expertise that you guys are sharing with us and your time, and really just the insights of the trends and outlook for us and keeping us grounded on what's happening out there today. So thank you so much, and virtual round of applause for you guys. I hope to continue this conversation with you as we move through this processes. So thanks so much. Unfortunately, I'll have to forego, given the timing, our convening in terms of the conference, but hopefully we'll continue this conversation. And I'm going to actually now move into the public comment period. So thank you all so much. And I'll turn it over to John to walk through some logistics on the public comment period.
Great. All right. Thank you, Leslie. And thank you to the panelists. And so we've had a lot of good information so far, but we've gone long in our timing, as you may have noticed. I hope you're not worn out, but be assured we are not out of time if you want to give input here. CARB staff are going to be here to take input. However, if you do need to leave and you have recommendations for this process, either of these issues we covered today, please get in touch at the email on the screen, the sustainablecommunities@arb.ca.gov. So we'll now open the workshop for public comments and recommendations. As I mentioned before, to keep time for more people, given our late hour, we will ask the commenters stay within 3 minutes. We will have an on-screen timer to show how much time is left. If you would like to speak, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. If you're on the phone, use *9 to raise your hand. When it is your turn, I will call out your name and allow you to unmute your microphone. If you would like to write a comment or question, you can use the Q&A function. And note that we have received many comments in the Q&A function already. We will not read out everything in the Q&A system if something is a comment and not a question. However, we are receiving all comments today, both verbally and in the Q&A system, and we'll be reviewing and considering them. And now let's go to the comments and questions. We'll see if there are any hands raised. Don't see any hands raised at this time. We did have some, but I think maybe those people may have had to leave. So I'm looking here, or any of in the written. I don't see that either. So we'll give it a few minutes here. Like I said, please do send any recommendations or feedback or information you have to the address on screen right now, sustainablecommunities@arb.ca.gov. All right, well, I think maybe we wore people out with all this information, and I do hope we get more comments from people. And so I think at this point, we will move on to the end. And I probably will turn it back over to Leslie if you have any final words.
Struggling with my technology at this point. No, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has attended today, who's stuck with us through this timing. We do appreciate your interest and your stamina in getting through these topics as we work through our 375 program and really discuss the changes moving ahead in terms of how we can really promote greenhouse gas emission reductions and make our communities more livable as we move forward. So please let us know if you do have any further thoughts. As John mentioned, here is on this screen where you can get in touch with us. The email address here is sustainablecommunities@arb.ca.gov. Well, everyone have a great evening. Thank you.